March 19, 1945, roughly 50 miles from Japan's shoreline, the aircraft carrier USS Franklin trembled under yet another blast. Lieutenant Commander Joseph T. O'Callaghan steadied himself against the rail as the ship shuddered for the 23rd time in under an hour. Thick smoke rolled through passageways and hatches, turning the carrier into a choking maze. On the hangar deck, crews directed fine sprays of water into flames that had engulfed fuel, aircraft, and ordnance. Just a few years earlier, naval officers might have dismissed such misting devices as ineffective curiosities. Now, those fog nozzles were the thin line preventing the deaths of hundreds of sailors trapped aboard. The adoption of this seemingly modest firefighting tool marked one of the most significant shifts in U.S. naval practice during World War II. Its origins did not lie with admirals or ship designers, but with municipal firefighters, men accustomed to battling blazes in crowded tenements and waterfront warehouses. Their experience taught them that a controlled mist of water could sometimes suppress heat and flame more effectively than a heavy stream. Few realized that their persistence, despite early rejection by naval authorities, would eventually influence naval doctrine, save thousands of lives, and reshape shipboard firefighting for decades. To understand how this change took hold, it is necessary to look back to the crisis that forced the Navy to reevaluate its methods. That turning point came on December 7, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor exposed major weaknesses in American naval preparedness, particularly in dealing with large-scale shipboard fires. Within less than 2 hours, the Pacific Fleet suffered devastating losses that would alter naval policy for generations. The battleship USS Arizona was destroyed in minutes when an explosion in her forward magazine tore the vessel apart. The blast was so powerful it lifted part of the ship out of the water before she settled and sank. More than 1,100 crew members were killed, many trapped below decks as flames and flooding spread faster than damage control teams could respond. Nearby, USS Oklahoma capsized after repeated torpedo strikes. Hundreds of sailors were trapped inside the overturned hull. Rescuers heard them pounding for days as cutting crews tried desperately to reach them. Some survived, but most did not. Other ships also suffered heavily from fires that proved difficult to contain. West Virginia burned for more than a day as oil leaking from ruptured tanks fed flames on the water's surface and throughout the ship. Fire crews lacked both the tools and techniques to extinguish petroleum-based fires or cool overheated compartments filled with vapor. California slowly sank over several days while fires raged above decks and flooding spread below. Nevada, the only battleship able to get underway during the attack, eventually had to be run aground to prevent blocking the harbor channel as uncontrolled fires threatened her magazines. The pattern was unmistakable. Enemy bombs and torpedoes caused the initial damage, but uncontrolled fires often turned survivable situations into total losses. Ships that might have been saved were instead consumed because crews lacked effective equipment and modern firefighting strategies. One officer who examined the disaster closely was Lieutenant Harold J. Burke, a naval reservist who had spent 2 decades with the New York City Fire Department before entering active service. His civilian career had exposed him to a wide range of urban fires, crowded residential buildings, chemical warehouses, and industrial sites, where traditional firefighting methods often proved inadequate. Over time, he learned that different types of fires required tailored responses. In some situations, a carefully applied mist could absorb heat and generate steam more efficiently than a heavy stream of water. By the late 1932s, Burke had risen to deputy chief in the FDNY, overseeing large-scale operations, training, and equipment decisions. Urban fire departments had begun adopting fog nozzles for certain scenarios, especially flammable liquid fires where solid streams could spread burning fuel. Burke saw firsthand how these techniques improved outcomes, cooling superheated gases and controlling fires that conventional methods struggled to contain. When he joined the Navy, Burke brought this knowledge with him. Assigned to evaluate shipboard damage control practices, he was troubled by what he found. Naval firefighting methods in 1941 still relied heavily on approaches developed in earlier centuries. Sailors used bucket brigades or directed straight streams of water at flames, assuming that greater volume would eventually extinguish any fire. While such tactics worked reasonably well on wooden ships with smaller contained blazes, they were poorly suited to modern steel warships filled with fuel, munitions, and complex machinery. Steel construction conducted heat rapidly, creating extremely hot compartments that were hazardous to enter. Fuel and aviation gasoline produced fires that spread across surfaces and generated dangerous vapors. Traditional solid streams often failed to cool these environments or could even worsen the situation by scattering burning liquid. Yet naval doctrine continued to emphasize close-range attacks using large hoses and high volumes of water. The events at Pearl Harbor demonstrated that these assumptions were outdated. The Navy's inability to control fires had contributed significantly to the loss of ships and lives. In the years that followed, pressure mounted to reconsider equipment, training, and tactics. The introduction of fog nozzles, once viewed as impractical, gradually gained acceptance as their effectiveness became clear in both training and combat conditions. By the time of the Franklin disaster in 1945, these innovations had become essential. Sailors using water fog techniques could cool overheated spaces, suppress vapor ignition, and limit the spread of fuel fires. What began as a concept borrowed from urban firefighting evolved into a standard feature aboard American warships. The shift illustrated how practical experience from civilian emergency services could transform military doctrine, ultimately improving survivability at sea and establishing procedures that would remain in use for decades. The arrival of carrier-based aviation transformed naval logistics and risk. Aircraft carriers began carrying enormous volumes of aviation fuel, often more than 150,000 gallons stored in tanks spread across the ship and moved through extensive piping systems to fueling points on hangar and flight decks. Alongside this fuel were bombs, rockets, and ammunition for large air groups. Together, these elements created a level of vulnerability that far exceeded anything earlier warships had faced. Despite this, naval firefighting doctrine had not kept pace with the new hazards. When Burke inspected vessels outfitted with fire mains and hydrants throughout their compartments, he found equipment that reflected older assumptions. Ships carried straight-stream nozzles of many sizes, from handheld hoses to large monitors capable of delivering massive water flow. Damage control crews were trained to deploy hoses, maintain pressure, and direct solid streams toward flames. What was missing, however, was any understanding that such methods were poorly suited to the kinds of fuel-fed fires modern carriers could experience. When Burke asked how crews would handle aviation gasoline fires, officers described overwhelming the flames with water volume. He explained that solid streams would disperse burning fuel and spread the blaze rather than extinguish it. His warnings were often met with indifference or irritation, as some saw him as an outsider challenging long-standing naval practice. Training programs reinforced these outdated approaches. Instruction emphasized hose handling, pressure management, and aiming water at the apparent seat of a fire, methods little changed from earlier eras of wooden ships. Crews received almost no education on fire behavior, heat transfer, steam production, or the hazards of applying water directly to burning liquids. They were also not taught how to cool overheated compartments before entry. Burke repeatedly submitted reports detailing these shortcomings and urged adoption of fog nozzles and updated training methods. His recommendations were acknowledged but largely ignored. For generations, the Navy had fought fires in the same manner, and many saw no reason to accept guidance from a civilian firefighter without sea service. The attack on Pearl Harbor forced a reckoning. In the aftermath of December 7, assessment teams surveyed the harbor, photographing wrecked ships, interviewing survivors, and reconstructing the events that turned survivable damage into catastrophic loss. Through his role in the Navy's Damage Control Evaluation Office, Burke obtained copies of these investigations. The evidence confirmed his concerns. Many ships followed the same pattern: initial damage from bombs or torpedoes, followed by fires that spread beyond control and ultimately destroyed vessels that might otherwise have been saved. Photographs and testimony revealed repeated failures. Crews used solid water streams on burning fuel, only to watch flames spread as water scattered oil across decks and into adjacent compartments. Powerful streams flooded spaces without suppressing the fire, sometimes causing ships to capsize or sink before flames were contained. Heat and smoke repeatedly forced firefighters to withdraw, leaving them without a way to cool compartments enough to re-enter. Ammunition detonated when nearby magazines overheated, killing personnel and igniting new fires. Sailors described being unable to approach within dozens of feet of intense blazes and watching helplessly as their efforts proved ineffective. These experiences also had a psychological toll. Training had taught crews that strong water streams could handle any fire. When those streams failed, many felt powerless. Some abandoned efforts early, convinced nothing could stop the flames. Others persisted beyond safe limits and died trying to control fires with tools unsuited to the task. Burke compiled the findings into a comprehensive proposal calling for immediate adoption of fog nozzles and a complete revision of naval firefighting training. He drew on municipal firefighting experience, presented data showing the effectiveness of fog patterns against fuel fires, and explained the underlying physics. He also outlined a rapid training program that could improve shipboard firefighting within months. The report circulated through naval engineering and training offices but again met resistance. Critics questioned whether techniques from city fire departments applied at sea. Some argued that fog nozzles appeared weak because they delivered a fine mist rather than a heavy stream. Others insisted that better use of existing methods would suffice. Institutional reluctance stemmed from several factors. Accepting Burke's conclusions meant acknowledging that some Pearl Harbor losses resulted from inadequate doctrine as well as surprise attack. Implementing his recommendations would require replacing equipment across the fleet, rewriting manuals, and retraining thousands of sailors. It would also challenge long-standing traditions central to naval identity. Burke found himself confronting not only technical misunderstanding, but also cultural inertia and bureaucratic self-protection. His proposals represented a fundamental shift, and large institutions rarely embrace such change quickly, even when evidence is compelling. Meanwhile, the war continued, ships kept burning, and each new loss underscored the cost of relying on outdated firefighting methods. On 8 May 1942, the aircraft carrier USS Lexington was ultimately destroyed by fires that spiraled beyond control after the Battle of the Coral Sea. During the engagement, she absorbed several bomb and torpedo strikes, serious damage, but not necessarily fatal. Her damage control teams initially managed to contain the first outbreaks, and for hours there was real hope the ship could be preserved. That changed when gasoline vapors trapped in spaces ruptured by torpedoes ignited. A violent internal explosion followed, sparking deep-seated fires that were far harder to reach. Crews attacked with conventional solid water streams, yet leaking aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid continued to feed the flames in ways those streams could not suppress. Temperatures in nearby compartments rose rapidly, setting off stored ammunition and igniting additional blazes faster than they could be contained. Before long, fire spread across several decks, magazine detonations shook the carrier, and the situation deteriorated beyond recovery. 216 sailors died before the order came to abandon and scuttle the ship. One of the Pacific Fleet's few available fleet carriers had been lost not only because of enemy hits, but because the resulting fires proved impossible to control. A similar sequence unfolded on 15 September 1942 when the carrier USS Wasp was struck by torpedoes from a Japanese submarine southeast of San Cristobal Island in the Solomon Islands. 3 hits on the starboard side ruptured fuel tanks and ignited widespread fires across the hangar deck. Aviation gasoline spilled freely, forming burning pools that spread into adjoining compartments. Damage control teams again used high-pressure solid streams, but the force of the water scattered flaming fuel rather than smothering it. Within half an hour, fires raged on multiple levels. Ammunition began detonating, killing firefighters and making close-range suppression impossible. Electrical power failed, reducing pump output and weakening water pressure throughout the ship. With pressure dropping, the already ineffective streams became useless. Heat warped structural steel. After 3 hours of unsuccessful efforts, the crew abandoned ship. 193 men were killed, and destroyers later scuttled the carrier. It was another case where post-damage fires, not just the initial torpedo hits, sealed the carrier's fate. Smaller vessels experienced the same pattern. Destroyers struck by bombs or torpedoes often saw fires spread faster than crews could respond. Their tight internal layouts allowed flames to reach magazines within minutes, leading to devastating explosions. Some cruisers survived initial hits only to be consumed by fires that traditional methods could not bring under control. Each incident reinforced earlier warnings that firefighting practices at sea were inadequate, yet institutional resistance slowed reform. By late 1942, the number of ships lost primarily to fire had grown too large to dismiss. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, demanded an explanation for why damaged ships were being lost to onboard fires rather than saved by damage control teams. His pressure forced the Bureau of Ships to examine its equipment and training. This scrutiny created an opening for Lieutenant Commander Burke, who had been advocating the use of fog nozzles. But he needed support from someone with enough authority to overcome bureaucratic inertia. That support arrived when Rear Admiral Edward L. Cochrane became Chief of the Bureau of Ships on 1 November 1942. A Naval Academy graduate and engineer by background, Cochrane had spent his career in ship design, construction, and propulsion. Unlike many senior officers whose experience was largely operational, he possessed deep technical knowledge and a reputation for innovation. He assumed leadership during the largest shipbuilding effort in U.S. history, yet the loss of vessels to uncontrolled fires threatened to undermine that investment. Cochrane quickly ordered a thorough review of damage control systems with special attention to firefighting tools and procedures. Recognizing the moment, Burke arranged through intermediaries to present his case for fog nozzles. Their meeting proved more rigorous than expected. Cochrane listened, then challenged Burke with detailed technical questions about heat transfer, fluid dynamics, and thermodynamics. He wanted precise explanations: how fog patterns improved heat absorption, what droplet sizes were most effective, and how steam generation compared with that from solid streams under varying pressures. Burke responded with both theory and field experience from his time with the New York Fire Department, citing specific incidents where fog techniques had succeeded after conventional streams failed. He also acknowledged situations where solid streams still had advantages. Cochrane respected Burke's expertise but remained cautious. The fine mist produced by fog nozzles appeared, at first glance, less substantial than a solid jet of water. He needed measurable proof that the method truly worked better under controlled conditions. He made his position clear: the Navy would not alter doctrine based solely on theory or civilian practice. If Burke wanted serious consideration, he would have to demonstrate the effectiveness of fog nozzles in a test environment. Burke agreed without hesitation, promising to arrange a demonstration within a week to prove the concept. Burke devoted the following week to preparing what he considered the most critical demonstration of his career. He secured a naval shipyard site equipped for controlled fire experiments where realistic blazes could be produced without endangering personnel. Aviation gasoline, the same high-octane fuel used by carrier aircraft and responsible for some of the most hazardous shipboard fires, was acquired for the tests. A steel training compartment was constructed to mirror conditions aboard warships: tight spaces, metal bulkheads, and poor ventilation. He gathered both standard damage control gear and alternative equipment for comparison. Solid-bore nozzles of different sizes were assembled alongside several Rockwood fog nozzles. To eliminate operator bias, Burke recruited seasoned firefighters from both the New York Fire Department and Navy training schools. Their experience ensured that any performance differences would reflect the tools themselves rather than skill levels. Most importantly, Burke installed instruments to collect objective data. Thermocouples were placed throughout the compartment to track temperature changes. Flow meters would measure water usage precisely, and timers would record how long each method required to suppress and extinguish the flames. Burke intended to rely on quantifiable results rather than opinion. Cochrane attended the event with senior representatives from the Bureau of Ships and the Navy's Training Command. Some observers arrived with genuine curiosity, while others expected the civilian-influenced approach to fail and hoped to reaffirm traditional methods. Burke opened with a briefing. He explained that 3 separate burns would be conducted, first using a standard 21-2-inch solid stream operated by experienced Navy personnel, then using a fog nozzle on an equivalent hose with equally skilled operators, and finally a direct side-by-side comparison. Each trial would involve igniting 20 gallons of aviation gasoline, enough to create a serious but controlled fire. The first test began with fuel spread across the steel deck and ignited. Flames erupted instantly, filling the compartment with thick smoke and intense heat. Even observers standing about 20 feet away could feel the radiant heat. A damage control team advanced and directed a high-pressure solid stream at the base of the flames. As Burke had anticipated, the force of the stream pushed burning fuel across the deck, widening the fire's footprint. Some of the water passed through the flames without absorbing significant heat and drained away unused. Although flames weakened slightly where the stream struck directly, they intensified elsewhere as scattered fuel ignited new areas. After 2 minutes of constant spraying, much of the floor was still burning. It took over 5 minutes to extinguish the fire completely, leaving the compartment flooded with several inches of water and still dangerously hot. Burke pointed out the measurements. Just over 5 minutes to extinguish, more than 400 gallons of water used, temperatures still above safe entry levels, and significant flooding an outcome that could threaten a damaged ship's stability. The compartment was dried and reset for the second trial. This time, the team advanced with a fog nozzle set to a wide spray. Instead of aiming directly at the flames, they directed the mist slightly above them, creating a cloud of droplets that descended through the fire while cooling the superheated gases overhead. The effect was immediate. Within half a minute, flames began to shrink across the space. After about a minute, only scattered pockets remained. By 90 seconds, the fire was fully out. The crew then swept the spray across overhead surfaces and bulkheads to cool the entire compartment. Sensors showed the temperature dropping from more than 1200 degrees to under 300. Water usage was minimal and flooding negligible. Burke emphasized that the fog pattern increased surface area for heat absorption and converted water to steam more efficiently, producing faster and safer results with far less water. For the third demonstration, both methods were used at the same time. 2 teams entered together, one with a solid stream, the other with a fog nozzle. The fog team achieved knockdown in under a minute, while the solid stream crew continued battling scattered flames several minutes later. The exercise was halted once the contrast became obvious. Cochrane concluded that the data and visual evidence were decisive. Fog nozzles controlled fires faster with less water and left compartments cooler and safer. Some officers raised concerns, arguing that results in controlled conditions might not translate to combat and that retraining crews or replacing equipment across the fleet would be costly. Cochrane dismissed the objections. He had witnessed fires extinguished in a fraction of the time using a fraction of the water. Delaying adoption, he argued, would only increase the risk of losing ships and sailors to preventable fires. He ordered immediate implementation and assigned Burke to lead a fleet-wide training program with full support. Turning the demonstration into operational training posed a massive challenge. Thousands of sailors required instruction, new facilities had to be built, and instructors needed preparation. Traditional timelines would have stretched for years, but wartime urgency allowed only months. Burke began assembling a team and soon identified Lieutenant Kilduff, a Navy reservist with experience in the Boston Fire Department and in recruit training. Together, they formed the nucleus of a new approach to naval damage control instruction. Their training philosophy differed from conventional military methods. Instead of relying primarily on classroom teaching followed by limited drills, they emphasized realistic, hands-on fire scenarios that simulated actual shipboard conditions as closely as safety allowed. They believed their confidence and effectiveness came from direct experience. The first facility opened at the Boston Naval Yard in June 1942 at the K Street Annex in South Boston. Burke and Kilduff designed and built full-scale steel compartments using materials salvaged from decommissioned ships. These mock-ups recreated the confined spaces, restricted access, and poor ventilation typical of warships. Controlled fuel fires generated intense heat and smoke while remaining within safe limits for trainees. The program marked the beginning of a major transformation in naval firefighting and damage control training. At the heart of the program stood a full-scale mock-up of a carrier hangar deck designed to recreate the kind of aviation fuel fires that had destroyed ships like Lexington and Wasp. The structure measured roughly 50 by 30 feet, built with a steel deck and an overhead ventilation network that could be sealed off to mimic combat damage. Fuel delivery lines allowed instructors to spread burning gasoline across the surface, producing realistic pools of flame. Although emergency shoot-offs, suppression gear, and clearly marked escape routes were always in place, trainees still faced authentic heat, smoke, and fire behavior. Additional training environments included a simulated engine room with fuel oil blazes, a berthing area filled with burning Class A materials, and a series of smaller compartments used to teach core firefighting skills. Each training proc contained monitoring equipment so instructors could track conditions and maintain safety while still pushing students to operate under extreme stress. The curriculum designed by Burke and Kilduff followed a clear progression from fundamentals to complex scenarios. The first day opened with a short classroom block about 4 hours covering fire dynamics, heat transfer, and the principles behind fob nozzle use. Sailors learned when fog patterns were most effective, how to adjust nozzle settings for different situations, and why solid streams sometimes remained necessary. After that, the emphasis shifted almost entirely to practical drills, wearing full protective clothing helmets, gloves, and heavy jackets. Students practiced donning breathing apparatus, inspecting gear, and working in coordinated teams. Their first live fire experience took place in a small compartment trainer where instructors ignited controlled fires. Trainees approached from safe distances, applied fog patterns, advanced as flames weakened, and completed full extinguishment. The sequence was repeated again and again until responses became instinctive. On the second day, conditions intensified, fires grew larger, and scenarios more realistic. Students learned to force open doors pressurized by heat, move hose lines through smoke-filled corridors, and operate in environments where visibility dropped to nothing. Instructors demonstrated flashover in controlled settings, showing how cooling overhead gases with fog streams could prevent sudden ignition of superheated atmospheres. Temperatures inside the training spaces climbed as high as 500–600 UF. The experience demanded both physical endurance and psychological resilience. Many trainees found the conditions frightening, but repetition and coaching gradually replaced fear with competence. The final day brought a full-scale exercise, a simulated hangar deck inferno fueled by aviation gasoline, with heavy smoke and mock casualties needing rescue. Teams coordinated multiple hose lines, some cooling compartments while others attacked the main fire. Communication had to continue despite zero visibility. Discipline and teamwork were essential. By the end, the change in confidence was striking. Sailors who had arrived uncertain or anxious left having repeatedly suppressed intense fires using reliable methods. Later reports from combat suggested that, although real battle conditions involved greater danger and actual casualties, the psychological shock was reduced because crews had already faced similar environments in training. Burke and Kilduff personally prepared the first group of 260 instructors through a demanding 3-week course. These graduates were then dispatched to establish firefighting schools at major naval bases across the continental United States. Instructor candidates needed practical experience, teaching ability, technical knowledge, and leadership. Many came from civilian fire departments or reserve units, bringing valuable expertise. Their training included not only suppression techniques but also instructional methods, safety oversight, equipment upkeep, and student assessment. Burke stressed the importance of maintaining realism while avoiding unnecessary risk, drawing on his experience with the FDNY to emphasize repetition, muscle memory, and managing fear. As new instructors spread across the fleet, the program expanded in a standardized way. San Diego opened its school in August 1942, followed by Norfolk in September. By year's end, similar facilities operated at Great Lakes, Charleston, Seattle, Pearl Harbor, and numerous other bases. Each used identical training structures built to Burke's specifications, ensuring uniform methods throughout the Navy. This consistency allowed crews from different ships and regions to work together seamlessly. Sailors trained in Boston used the same tactics and equipment as those trained in San Diego, making coordinated damage control efforts far more predictable during combat. The curriculum eventually included dedicated courses for officers, focusing on tactics, coordination, and leadership during shipboard fires. Burke insisted that officers understand the reasoning behind orders, not just the procedures. They practiced managing multiple fires simultaneously, allocating resources, and deciding priorities under pressure through tabletop exercises and simulations. By mid-1943, the impact was clear. Thousands of sailors had mastered fog nozzle techniques, and ships heading into combat carried crews confident in their firefighting abilities. The psychological shift mattered as much as the technical one. Fire was no longer seen as an unstoppable force, but as a threat that could be confronted with training and discipline. Still, instruction alone was not enough. To protect the fleet effectively, ships needed large numbers of fog nozzles, and wartime production had to meet that demand quickly despite industrial constraints. The U.S. time. Navy's Bureau of Ships moved quickly to secure large-scale production of fog nozzles, placing contracts with several companies to speed delivery and reduce dependence on any single supplier. Rockwood Sprinkler Company emerged as the lead manufacturer for the all-purpose fog nozzle design championed by Burke. Its Worcester, Massachusetts facility expanded rapidly, adding workers and running extra shifts to keep up with wartime demand. By the start of 1943, Rockwood was turning out thousands of units each month. To simplify both supply and training, the Navy standardized two versions, one for 1.5-inch hoses and another for 2.5-inch lines. Ships were equipped with both sizes, the smaller for routine firefighting and the larger for major emergencies. Each nozzle could switch between fog, straight stream, and shoot-off, giving crews flexibility in combat situations. Extension applicators allowed firefighters to direct fog into spaces too hazardous to enter, such as sealed compartments or ventilation shafts. Producing these nozzles required careful machining. Internal components had to break water into fine mist patterns while operating under high pressure, so tolerances were tight and reliability essential. A malfunction during battle could be fatal. Rockwood therefore introduced strict inspection procedures, including pressure testing every unit and visually checking spray patterns before shipment. Distribution posed its own challenges. New ships received fog nozzles as part of their standard damage control kits during construction, but vessels already in service had to be retrofitted. The Navy created dedicated supply channels to deliver equipment to forward bases. In the Pacific, nozzles traveled through the same logistics network that supplied ammunition and spare parts. Supply ships carried them to major anchorages such as Ulithi, Eniwetok, and Pearl Harbor, where vessels could receive them during resupply stops. By late 1943, most frontline ships had at least partial coverage. By mid-1944, nearly the entire fleet was equipped. Traditional solid stream nozzles were not discarded entirely. They remained useful for long-range firefighting, external cooling, and other specific tasks. Burke's goal was not to eliminate them, but to make fog nozzles the primary tool for the most dangerous onboard fires. Damage control stations were reorganized so fog nozzles, extension tools, spare parts, and cleaning kits were readily accessible. Crews were trained to maintain them, since salt deposits could clog the narrow passages that created the fog pattern. Sailors learned to disassemble, clean, and test the equipment regularly, replacing worn components as needed. The overall cost of outfitting the fleet was significant but manageable. Compared with major naval weapons systems, fog nozzles were inexpensive, around $75 each. A destroyer might carry about 20, totaling roughly $1,500, while an aircraft carrier might carry 60 for about $4,500. Even across the entire fleet, the investment amounted to only hundreds of thousands of dollars. Trivial next to the cost of ships themselves and negligible compared with the lives and vessels saved. Early real-world tests came during scattered combat incidents in 1943 and early 1944. As ships took hits and fires broke out, crews trained in the new methods managed to save vessels that might previously have been lost. Each success reinforced confidence in the new approach. In November 1943, the light cruiser Birmingham was struck by a torpedo that ruptured fuel tanks and ignited fires in 2 engineering spaces. Damage control teams used fog nozzles indirectly through ventilation ducts to cool compartments too hot for entry. Within 40 minutes, the fires were under control, and the ship remained operational after temporary repairs. Under earlier doctrine, the compartments might have been flooded, risking the vessel's survival. In January 1944, the destroyer Spence endured bomb hits near the Gilbert Islands. Fires erupted in crew berthing areas filled with flammable furnishings. Teams used fog to cool nearby spaces and limit spread while attacking the main blaze. Because the fog required less water, the ship avoided dangerous flooding and was able to return to port under its own power. One of the most dramatic demonstrations came on April 16, 1945, off Okinawa, when the destroyer Laffey faced a concentrated kamikaze assault. In just over an hour, she was struck by multiple bombs and aircraft crashes, each igniting new fires. Crews fought continuously, using fog to suppress flames fed by aviation fuel and burning debris. Solid streams would likely have spread the fuel and worsened the situation, but fog smothered the flames and limited water accumulation that could have capsized the heavily damaged ship. Despite heavy casualties, Laffey survived and was later repaired. Her ordeal became a powerful example of the effectiveness of improved firefighting methods. The battleship South Dakota provided another case. In June 1944, a bomb penetrated to a handling room containing ready ammunition. The resulting fire threatened the main magazines below. Firefighting teams directed fog through deck openings with extension tools, cooling the area and displacing oxygen. At the same time, other crews cooled the magazines themselves. The blaze was contained in about 35 minutes, and the ship stayed in action. The carrier Hancock also benefited from the new techniques after a kamikaze strike in April 1945 ignited aviation fuel on the hangar deck. With the sprinkler system damaged, fog nozzles became the primary firefighting tool. Crews attacked from multiple angles, both directly and through ventilation pathways. The fire was brought under control in just over an hour, and the carrier resumed operations soon afterward. These and many similar incidents confirmed the value of Burke's reforms. Ships that might once have been lost were saved, and casualties were reduced. Confidence in the equipment and training spread throughout the fleet. The carrier Franklin had already demonstrated the usefulness of fog nozzles before her near destruction in March 1945. On October 30, 1944, while operating near the Philippines during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, she was hit by a kamikaze that crashed through the flight deck and exploded among aircraft on the hangar deck. Fuel ignited instantly, triggering a chain reaction of explosions from bombs, rockets, and ammunition. Within minutes, fires raged across the hangar. Trained damage control teams responded immediately, deploying fog nozzles from multiple access points. By cooling superheated gases and reducing oxygen levels, they created conditions that eventually allowed closer firefighting efforts and helped prevent even greater disaster. Other firefighting crews relied on extension wands to reach sections that were too dangerous to approach directly. By channeling water fog through ventilation shafts and torn sections of the hangar deck, they created protective patterns that stopped flames from spreading into nearby compartments while other teams concentrated on the main blaze. Multiple fog streams working in unison produced heavy steam, which both cooled overheated structures and pushed oxygen away from the fire. This coordinated approach proved highly effective in containing the disaster. The struggle to keep USS Franklin afloat that October lasted roughly 2.5 hours. Inside the hangar, temperatures climbed beyond 2000 degrees hot enough to bend structural steel and liquefy aluminum. Solid streams of water would have accomplished little under such conditions. The water would have vaporized before reaching the heart of the fire. Instead, carefully directed fog streams, optimized to generate steam, delivered better cooling and suppression even in the extreme heat. Damage control teams rotated in shifts, pulling exhausted sailors out before heat stress overcame them and replacing them with fresh crews to keep the effort continuous. Working methodically, the sailors cooled one section at a time, extinguishing controlled fires and ensuring they did not reignite. By 15:00 hours, the major blazes had been eliminated. 2 hours later, remaining hotspots were out, and temperatures had dropped enough for inspection teams to enter the hangar and assess the damage. The October attack killed 56 crewmen and wounded 60, most during the initial blasts and their immediate aftermath. Despite the devastation, Franklin remained afloat and withdrew under her own power. Temporary repairs at Ulithi allowed the carrier to return to combat within 3 weeks. Official reports later credited effective training and the strategic use of fog nozzles as key reasons the ship survived. The October incident gave the crew valuable experience. It confirmed that their drills were effective under real combat conditions, revealed weaknesses in coordination and communication, and built confidence that even severe shipboard fires could be controlled with proper techniques. Those lessons would become critical just 5 months later, when Franklin faced a far more destructive attack. On March 19, 1945, the carrier endured damage that by all expectations should have destroyed her. Operating about 50 miles off Japan's coast as part of Task Force 58, she was launching strikes against Kyushu in support of the Okinawa campaign. At 708 hours, a lone Japanese dive bomber slipped through heavy cloud cover at low altitude, avoiding radar detection until it was nearly overhead. The aircraft released 2 bombs that struck the flight and hangar decks at the worst possible moment. At the time, 31 planes sat on the flight deck, fully fueled and armed for the morning's first launch. Another 22 were stored below in the hangar, also loaded and ready. Together, these aircraft carried more than 15,000 gallons of aviation fuel, along with rockets, 500-pound bombs, and large quantities of ammunition. The first bomb pierced the flight deck near the centerline and exploded in the hangar below, instantly igniting aircraft packed into the confined space. Fuel tanks ruptured, spilling gasoline across the deck and creating a massive fire that raced through the 400-foot hangar. Heat quickly triggered the detonation of ammunition and ordnance on the burning planes. Moments later, the second bomb struck near the number 3 elevator, penetrating to the gallery deck. It detonated in crew berthing areas, killing many sailors instantly and starting fires across several decks. Ruptured fuel lines fed gasoline into the growing inferno, while the blast disabled vital systems, including firefighting lines, electrical circuits, and communications. Within minutes, a number of tiny TIM rockets broke loose from aircraft engulfed in flames. Each of these large rockets, carrying heavy warheads, became uncontrolled projectiles ricocheting around the hangar. They slammed into bulkheads, burst into nearby compartments, and detonated on impact, starting new fires and spreading deadly fragments. Machine gun ammunition began exploding in massive quantities, sending bullets tearing through thin walls and turning the hangar into a lethal environment. Larger bombs and rockets soon followed, each detonation creating shockwaves, igniting additional fires, and spreading destruction throughout the ship. The first 10 minutes produced catastrophic casualties. Roughly 300 men were killed almost immediately, flight deck crews preparing aircraft, hangar personnel below, and sailors in nearby living quarters struck by the second explosion. Hundreds more suffered severe injuries, many with critical burns. Some were blown overboard by blasts, while others leapt into the sea in desperate attempts to escape the raging fires. The ship's medical spaces were soon unable to cope with the scale of injuries. Smoke flooded the engineering compartments, forcing the crew to abandon them and leaving the vessel without propulsion. Dead in the water roughly 50 miles off Japan, the carrier drifted while fires spread across 4 decks. With radio systems destroyed, no distress call could be sent. Water from broken fire mains and firefighting efforts pooled on the starboard side, creating a growing list that reached 13 degrees and threatened to worsen. In this crisis, Lieutenant Commander Joseph T. O'Callaghan, the ship's Catholic chaplain, joined forces with Engineering Officer Lieutenant Donald A. Gary to coordinate a massive firefighting and rescue effort. Callahan moved through the battered ship, rallying anyone still capable of helping: cooks, clerks, storekeepers, and any sailor not already tending the wounded or battling flames. Gary organized teams to reach men trapped below decks by smoke and fire. Equipped with fog nozzles, they advanced into areas that would have been inaccessible with conventional firefighting gear. Damage to the ship's water system left pressure far below normal. Electrical failures shut down pumps that typically maintained flow, and the hangar deck sprinklers had been destroyed. Firefighting crews relied on portable pumps and even bucket brigades where water lines had completely failed. In these conditions, fog nozzles proved essential. Traditional solid stream nozzles required strong pressure to be effective. With the reduced supply, they would have been nearly useless. Fog nozzles, however, could operate under low pressure, dispersing water into fine mist that cooled compartments and smothered flames. The struggle against the fires lasted 8 hours. Crews prioritized blazes that threatened critical areas, especially the forward magazines. If those detonated, the ship would have been lost instantly. By directing fog through ventilation systems, they lowered temperatures enough to prevent explosions even while adjacent compartments burned. When heat or ongoing blasts blocked direct entry, extension applicators allowed crews to project fog through openings and damaged bulkheads, gradually reducing temperatures until entry became possible. Teams rotated constantly, working until exhaustion before being replaced. Gary personally led rescue parties into areas where 300 men were trapped 3 decks below the hangar. The only access route passed through corridors with temperatures exceeding 500 degrees and visibility reduced to nothing. Using fog nozzles to create protective curtains of mist, the rescuers cooled the air enough to push briefly into these lethal spaces. Over 7 trips, they guided groups of survivors back to safety. In total, 252 men were saved through these efforts. The light cruiser Santa Fe eventually came alongside to assist, maneuvering dangerously close to the burning carrier. Her crew transferred additional hoses, fog nozzles, and portable pumps. These supplemented the damaged systems on the carrier and improved water pressure. Santa Fe also evacuated 833 survivors, including many wounded, easing the burden on the overwhelmed crew still fighting to save their ship. Throughout the day, the outcome remained uncertain. Fires repeatedly threatened the forward magazines, requiring constant cooling with fog streams. Ammunition continued to detonate, killing firefighters and igniting new blazes. Flooding increased the list to 17 degrees before counter-flooding stabilized the vessel. Gradually, however, the situation improved. By afternoon, the largest fires were under control, though smaller ones still burned. By evening, temperatures across the ship began to fall. On the night of March 19, all major fires had been extinguished, though flare-ups continued for days. Historical records differ on the final casualty numbers. Samuel Eliot Morrison's official naval history reports 724 killed and 265 wounded. Other sources, including the Naval History and Heritage Command, cite 807 killed and 487 wounded. The variation reflects different methods of counting, such as whether air group personnel or those who later died of wounds were included. Regardless of the exact figure, roughly 1/3 of the crew were killed or injured, the highest casualty rate of any surviving U.S. ship in the war. Despite catastrophic damage, the carrier remained afloat. Temporary repairs restored limited propulsion, allowing her to steam about 12,000 miles to New York under her own power. She arrived on April 28, 1945, heavily scarred. The flight deck warped, the island blackened, and the hull marked by explosions. Yet the ship had made it home. A post-war Bureau of Ships analysis concluded that fog nozzles were decisive in preventing total loss. Their ability to function with low pressure, cool compartments efficiently, suppress aviation fuel fires without spreading them, and generate steam that smothered flames proved critical. Without them, investigators determined, the ship likely would have been abandoned and scuttled within hours. Both Callahan and Gary received the Medal of Honor for their leadership and actions, awarded at the White House on January 23, 1946. While official citations emphasized their damage control efforts broadly, naval training programs later used the incident as a primary example of effective firefighting under extreme conditions. The broader impacts of improved damage control extended beyond a single ship. Enhanced firefighting methods, especially the adoption of fog nozzles and associated training, allowed USS forces in the Pacific to operate closer to enemy territory and endure kamikaze strikes with a greater chance of survival. Amphibious operations accepted higher risks, knowing damaged vessels could often be saved. Faster recovery of ships also helped maintain operational tempo. Admiral Chester Nimitz later highlighted these advancements in his post-war assessment, noting that improved firefighting capabilities were vital in sustaining fleet operations during the final campaigns of the Pacific War. The program's cumulative effect saved thousands of lives. Each vessel preserved meant hundreds of sailors survived who otherwise might have perished. In this case alone, roughly 2,000 crew members were still aboard when the fires were finally controlled. Had the ship sunk, most would have been lost. Financially, saving major warships also prevented enormous costs, as a fleet carrier required tens of millions of dollars and years of construction to replace. The rescue of the Franklin alone more than repaid the investment in Burke's training initiatives. Over time, the financial value of vessels saved from destruction amounted to hundreds of millions of dollars. More significant than the monetary impact, however, was the precedent his work established. Meaningful innovation could take root even inside conservative military systems when it was argued effectively and backed by results. Burke confronted long-standing naval doctrine and encountered resistance throughout the chain of command. Despite this, he pushed through sweeping reforms in both equipment and instruction. His achievements reinforced a broader lesson that transformative military ideas sometimes originate outside the armed forces from civilians whose expertise and viewpoints differ from institutional norms. He also reshaped the Navy's entire philosophy toward damage control. At the start of the 1942, firefighting was treated as a secondary duty, something addressed only after critical systems failed. By the end of World War II, it had become recognized as a core combat function vital to survival in battle. Specialized damage control teams were formed and trained to standards comparable to weapons crews, and their performance was assessed with equal rigor. Equally important was the shift in mindset among sailors. Early in the war, fires at sea were often seen as unstoppable and damage control as a last-ditch effort with slim odds of success. By 1945, crews approached onboard fires with confidence, treating them as tactical challenges that could be managed through training and proper tools. This transition from fatalism to disciplined confidence marked a deep cultural change within the fleet. Officers began planning for damage control with the same seriousness as offensive operations, positioning teams in advance, staging equipment, and preparing for likely damage scenarios. During combat, senior commanders monitored firefighting and containment efforts as closely as they tracked the tactical situation, making resource decisions that could determine whether a ship lived or sank. Standardized training fostered a shared operational culture across the Navy. Sailors trained at different bases using identical procedures could communicate seamlessly, relying on common terminology and expectations. Ships from separate units could coordinate quickly because their crews followed the same methods for equipment upkeep, tactics, and emergency response. Burke's influence coincided with parallel progress in Coast Guard doctrine. Lloyd Lehman, a civilian fire chief known for developing indirect fog application methods before the war, joined the Coast Guard as a commander and led the firefighting school at Fort McHenry in Baltimore. Using the Liberty ship Gaspar de Portela as a testing platform, Lehman conducted systematic experiments on fog nozzle performance. His work identified effective droplet sizes, spray patterns, and techniques for various fire conditions. In February 1945, he published his findings in Fire Engineering, offering scientific support for approaches Burke had already promoted through field experience. After the war, Lehman returned to municipal service as chief of the Parkersburg, West Virginia Fire Department. There, he adapted shipboard fog techniques to structural firefighting, reshaping how city departments handled building fires. His 1950 presentation, Little Drops of Water, demonstrated that indirect fog methods could suppress structural fires more efficiently than traditional solid stream attacks. Through layman's efforts, lessons learned in naval combat spread into civilian firefighting worldwide. Techniques first used to save warships became standard for protecting buildings. Fog nozzles grew common in fire departments because of their flexibility and effectiveness across different types of fires. Burke remained active through the end of the war and into the immediate post-war years, focusing on instructor training and further refinement of fog nozzle tactics. In July 1947, he was named chief of the New York City Fire Department, a position he formally assumed on August 1 of that year. Records indicate that he retired immediately upon taking office, though the reasons remain unclear. Reports from fire engineering at the time confirmed his swift departure. The role stayed vacant until Peter J. Loftus was appointed in August 1948. Even during his brief tenure, Burke influenced the FDNY's adoption of more realistic training environments and standardized operational methods modeled on naval programs. Afterward, he withdrew from public life. Details of his later years are scarce, and no confirmed death date appears in readily available archives. His legacy rests not on public recognition but on the ships preserved and lives saved through his innovations. Fog nozzle systems remained a staple of U.S. Navy firefighting for decades. Although equipment designs evolved, the central principle Burke championed, that fine water droplets provide superior cooling and steam production compared with solid streams, remained fundamental well into the late 20th century. The next major turning point in naval firefighting followed the devastating USS Forrestal fire on July 29, 1967, in the Gulf of Tonkin. An accidentally launched rocket struck a parked aircraft, rupturing fuel tanks and triggering explosions in a massive blaze that killed 134 personnel and injured 161. The disaster exposed ongoing shortcomings in damage control readiness, especially in combating aviation fuel fires. Film-forming foam (AFF) had been patented by the Navy in 1966 but had not yet been fully deployed across the fleet, highlighting the gap between technological development and operational implementation. The catastrophe in the fleet's forests and shipboard fires forced the Navy to mandate the installation of aqueous firefighting foam systems across its vessels and to revise its firefighting doctrine from top to bottom. Even so, fog-producing nozzles were never discarded. They remained a core tool because of their adaptability and their proven ability to combat different kinds of fires. Foam systems were introduced as an additional capability, not as a substitute. Through the 1970 seconds and 1980 seconds, these nozzles continued to be standard damage control equipment on naval ships. Generations of sailors practiced the same foundational methods first introduced by Burke, updated for newer vessels and evolving threats, but rooted in the same underlying principles. The fog nozzle endured for simple reasons. It was reliable, flexible, and grounded in unchanging physical laws. Breaking water into fine droplets increases surface area, which improves heat absorption and steam production, and those fundamentals remained true regardless of advances elsewhere in naval technology. Burke's influence did not stop with the Navy. After the war, municipal fire departments across the globe began adopting fog nozzle technology. Their decisions were shaped by its demonstrated success at sea and by veterans who carried their naval firefighting experience into civilian service. Adoption took time, but it steadily expanded. Departments that had once dismissed the technology became convinced after reviewing evidence gathered under combat conditions. Industrial fire brigades, especially those in petrochemical plants and refineries, also embraced the approach because it proved more effective against flammable liquid fires. Industrial emergency teams adopted not only the equipment but also the tactics developed by Burke and his colleague Lehman. They recognized that large fuel fires in refineries resembled the hazards faced aboard warships. As a result, training methods in civilian firefighting evolved to incorporate lessons learned during naval combat. Training facilities began constructing realistic mock-ups modeled after shipboard environments, exposing students to heat, smoke, and stress levels that approximated real emergencies. Instruction shifted away from purely theoretical classroom teaching toward practical drills. Students were expected to fight controlled fires rather than just study them. Over time, the concepts Burke promoted became central to global fire science education. Engineering and fire science programs began teaching the mechanics of heat transfer, steam generation, and the advantages of maximizing the surface area of water. They also explored the tactical differences between fog patterns and solid streams. By the early 1950s, ideas once dismissed as radical had become accepted doctrine, taught in academies worldwide as standard practice. The story of Lieutenant Harold J. Burke and the fob nozzle reveals broader lessons about innovation and institutional change, especially within military organizations confronting new technologies and doctrines. One recurring pattern is that major innovations often originate outside military structures. Civilian specialists can introduce perspectives and skills that internal systems lack. Burke did not invent the fog nozzle itself. Versions existed before he promoted it. His success came from applying municipal firefighting experience to a naval environment and persisting despite resistance. Without that external viewpoint, the Navy might never have recognized the nozzle's potential. Another lesson is that resistance to change weakens when superiority is proven under realistic conditions. Burke's explanations and technical arguments alone failed to persuade skeptics. What changed minds were controlled demonstrations that compared fob nozzles with traditional methods using measurable outcomes. Realistic fires, identical conditions, and quantifiable results created evidence that was difficult to ignore. Credibility came from demonstration rather than theory. Support from senior leadership also proved essential. Burke's expertise in testing laid the groundwork, but widespread adoption required an internal advocate with authority. Admiral Cochrane's backing helped overcome bureaucratic reluctance and ensured fleet-wide implementation. The combination of outside knowledge and internal command power made the difference. Standardized training was equally important. Burke did not limit instruction to a handful of specialists. He developed a scalable program that trained instructors who, in turn, taught thousands of sailors. This ensured consistent skills across the fleet and guaranteed that distributing new equipment translated into real capability. Resistance to innovation came from multiple directions. Some doubted the technology itself, a concern addressed through demonstrations. Others were uneasy with equipment that appeared less forceful than traditional streams. Results eventually overcame those perceptions. There was also institutional reluctance to admit that older methods were flawed, which Burke countered by framing the change as modernization rather than correction. Cost worries were mitigated by showing that the expense of new equipment was minor compared to the value of ships and lives saved. These patterns remain relevant. Technology continues to advance faster than doctrine, creating gaps between what can be done and what is actually practiced. Civilian experts often hold knowledge that military organizations need, yet cultural barriers sometimes prevent collaboration. Effective innovation requires addressing skepticism, discomfort, bureaucratic inertia, and financial concerns, just as Burke had to do. Modern armed forces could benefit from formal systems that identify and evaluate civilian innovations. If such mechanisms had existed earlier, the Navy might have adopted fog nozzle techniques before disaster forced reconsideration. Exchanges between civilian and military sectors accelerate progress in both directions. Burke carried municipal firefighting knowledge into the Navy, reshaping its capabilities. Layman later transferred naval experience back into civilian firefighting, influencing departments worldwide. Encouraging this kind of exchange can speed innovation across fields. Burke's story also highlights how history often overlooks individuals whose contributions are not dramatic but deeply consequential. He did not command fleets or win famous battles. Instead, he provided tools and training that saved ships and lives. He reshaped the Navy's approach to fire and damage control, fostering a culture of proactive, confident response that continues today. His work demonstrated that transformative ideas can come from unexpected sources and that persistence and evidence can overcome entrenched habits. When the damaged carrier USS Franklin passed the Statue of Liberty in April 1945, it carried clear proof of the value of Burke's efforts. The ship was heavily scarred, yet it remained afloat with hundreds of survivors who might otherwise have been lost. Burke was now present to witness its arrival. He stayed with the fleet, continuing to train sailors. His legacy, however, was visible in that battered vessel and in every life preserved. Recognition was never his goal. The ships saved, the personnel protected, and the doctrines improved stand as the true measure of his impact. His experience illustrates how determined individuals can reshape institutions, how civilian knowledge can strengthen military capability, and how small technical adjustments can produce far-reaching strategic effects. The widespread adoption of fault nozzle techniques shows that successful innovation depends not only on authority but on persistence, proof, and the willingness to challenge assumptions. That legacy continues wherever trained crews confront fire with effective tools, disciplined preparation, and the confidence that comes from knowing they are ready to prevail.